So a lot of kids have OCD, but they don't want help. And so parents are stuck trying to figure out, how do I help my kids? How do I help my kids when they're not necessarily wanting the help? I want to talk about how to tell the difference between OCD and just typical behavior, because it's hard to figure out what is the difference between just a regular habit, kids have regular habits, versus what is an OCD compulsion. So I'm going to go over a couple of different things that as parents you can do even if your child doesn't want any help with their OCD. Because a lot of times parents will say, Natasha, they don't want to work on it. And I don't even know if it's OCD, so I don't know what I'm doing. But I want to talk to you about things that you can do. So the first one is look and notice if your child has OCD compulsions. I have to say that the majority of time when I work with kids and they come into my practice, a lot of times the compulsions are completely missed. And maybe the parent knows one or two of the OCD compulsions, but the rest are not noticed at all. Or a lot of times parents will say, it's kind of a quirk or a habit. She's got a lot of quirks. She's got a lot of habits. She's got a lot of tics. And then when I meet the child, I'm like, ooh, those are not quirks or habits or tics. Those are compulsions. So how do you tell the difference? For starters, if your child has a predisposition to OCD or it runs in the family, pay closer attention to your kids and their actions and their behaviors. So a lot of times the behaviors will look like tics. I've worked with kids where they will blink, but they do it in a very purposeful way. So they might blink 3 times, or they might look up and then they might look down. There's a pattern to it. And so pay attention to the pattern. Kids who have just random tics, excuse me, they don't do it on purpose. It just happens and they have no control over it. So a lot of times I'll ask kids, when you do that, what are you doing that for? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, it's just a silly game, or it's just a habit. They're conscious of the fact that they're doing it. They're aware of it, and there's an intention behind it. Now, having said that, some kids are really embarrassed. And OCD is rampant in my family. And I know OCD very intimately. And one of my children has OCD, and he would deny it until he's blue in the face. He has a great excuse for all of his OCD behavior. And so maybe you're used to that. Not every kid is really open about having OCD. It's embarrassing and they think they're crazy. They don't know that it's a normal thing that happens to lots of kids. And so they often will make excuses. They'll hide their OCD. They will say, oh, I didn't know I was doing that. I had a girl that did this once in a while, total compulsion, and she would say, I just do this when I'm hot. My son was scooting down the stairs, and I was like, what are you doing? And he's like, it's just kind of fun. But yeah, when you do that every single time you're going down the stairs, it's not fun. There's something more behind that. So take what your kids say with a grain of salt, because they might be saying, oh, I do this because of blah, blah, blah. And it's not. A lot of times there's a meaning behind it. So you can ask them, but also you want to pay attention. So you want to see if they're doing it frequently, if you can find when they're doing it. Transient tics will just come and go. And so kids will just blink, or they'll clear their throat, and there's no rhyme or reason, and they're not conscious that they're doing it. OCD has intention. Kids are aware that they're doing it. And so they will do hand gestures. I don't want to hit my mic, but they'll do hand gestures. They'll do throat clearing. They'll look up, they'll look down. They'll do things with their hands. So if you're seeing some patterns, I'll give you an example. So we'll use my son a lot, sorry. But for a while, I would notice that when he's eating, especially on the couch before I stopped that kind of craziness, he would bounce up and down 3 times. And one time I was like, I notice every single time you're eating on the couch that you bounce up and down. I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, it's just in case I choke. I just want to make sure. And so I noticed, and every single time he was eating, he was bouncing up and down. And so if I hadn't picked up on that subtle behavior, I would have missed that. I'll give you another example. Because even though I'm a child therapist, it is like crazy hard for me to figure out sometimes my own kids, because that's just how it works, right? And I did take him to a therapist because I'm his mom and I'm not his therapist. And even last week, I think it was last week, he was there with a therapist and he said something that he does all the time. And he denies almost everything. For him to admit anything is pretty big. And he said, yeah, when I eat, and he's got his OCD issue, he doesn't have a lot of compulsions, but he just has one, but it's very, very scary because it restricts his eating. And so all of his OCD right now is just purely around his eating. He's got a lot of intrusive thoughts around food, and he's only 8 and he is just skin and bone. So even though I'm not seeing a lot of compulsions outside of eating, it's freaking me out because, it's his welfare. It's his medical health is really just declining. So anyway, we're talking to the therapist and he said, when I eat goldfish, which is one of his only go-to foods right now, he's surviving on goldfish. Apparently you can do that. And he said, I only eat it with my left hand. He's right-handed. And I have to use this pincer grip. He didn't call it pincer. He said, I just have to use this, with my pointy fingers. I never noticed that. And so now I watch him eating and sure enough, he's grabbing one at a time. How bizarre. So pay attention because you might be missing a lot of stuff. Now, the reason why that's really important is because OCD loves to go undercover. So you don't want OCD to go undercover. And part of that is, as parents, we deny it because it's horrible. We don't want to know that. We don't want to admit that our kids have OCD. We don't want to give them a disorder or name it. But ironically, that's incredibly helpful. So I always tell parents, don't shy away from telling them that it's OCD. Don't sugarcoat it with a different name because even though it seems like you're pathologizing it, every time I have ever told a kid in my practice, you know what? This is normal. There's a name for it. Other kids have this. People talk about this. People have this struggle. And they'll say, you're kidding me. You mean other people have the same thing? And I'll say, absolutely. And I'll say, there's a name for it. It's called obsessive compulsive disorder. And everything you've told me, I've heard a million times before. And there's a huge relief from those children that they're not crazy. Because it took forever, maybe half a session, for them to even tell me that this is happening. So for them to come back and realize that it's normal is a huge relief. So you want to open the communication up with your kids, and you don't want OCD to hide. Because as parents, we will kind of lie to ourselves. That's not really OCD, that's just a habit. And the kids will lie to themselves. They're like, I'm just weird. I don't want anyone to notice this. And so they hide it, which is bad as well. So you want to spot things that look quirky, and you want to recognize what is and isn't OCD. Now, sometimes sensory processing disorder gets lumped in because it looks very similar. What is the difference between sensory processing disorder and OCD? And unfortunately, a lot of kids have both, and so it gets really tricky. But the difference is, when you have sensory processing, you are sensitive all over the place depending on what your issue is. And so you might not like the way your jeans fit because they're scratchy, or your shoes are too tight, or your hair, it's too loose, it's too tight, it's too loose, it's too tight. But it's all physical of how it's feeling. And with OCD, there's a zillion types of different OCD. And you can check out my podcast at AT Parenting Anxious Kids. I'm trying to think what my podcast name is. And you can check out my YouTube videos, and I talk a lot about OCD themes and what the difference is. But when you have it just right OCD, nothing feels right. And so I might sit down and then I might have to get up and then I might have to sit down again. Or my shoes they don't feel just right. Versus if I have a sensory processing issue, the seam feels weird or the jeans feel too tight. They're very similar. So trust me, it's tricky. So moving forward, once you are vigilant and you're very aware of what to look for as far as compulsions, then you want to start helping your kid. And unfortunately, this is their battle, and so there's only so much that you can do to help them, but there are some pretty concrete things you can do. So the first thing I always tell parents is name it. It's really helpful to name it. Now, some kids are resistant to this and they really don't want you to name it, but I find it's helpful for many reasons. So for starters, you want to separate the OCD from the child. You don't want the child to feel like they are their OCD. That's sad. And the way that you're going to face the OCD is going to be to separate it. So name it something. Name it Mr. Worry. I like dictator for the older kids. In my house, I have a Mr. Bossy. I have a dictator. We also have a worry cloud because we kind of like double named it, so that wasn't really good. But you want to name it because you're going to start fighting your child's OCD and not your child. So even if your child's resistant, like my son is, and he doesn't really want to admit that he has any OCD, I will sometimes name it. So if I see him doing something that seems like a compulsion, I'd walk by and I'd say, it looks like Mr. Bossy's kind of bossing you around right now. Now, granted, he will probably bark back and he'll say, no, he's not. I just want to do this, because some kids are like that. But I will just at least have acknowledged it, and that helps kids kind of in their mind put a label on it and say, okay, maybe this is my OCD. And so it's a way for you to convey to your child that they're doing some compulsions, that you recognize they're doing compulsions without getting into a confrontation. So that's really helpful. Also, 99.9% of the time, kids with OCD are going to involve their parents in their compulsions. And so this gets missed almost all the time. So reassurance is really not reassurance. Reassurance almost always is a compulsion. And that's hard to tell the difference, but I'll tell you a little bit about how to tell the difference, because OCD and anxiety are like two peas in a pod, and people who are anxious do like a lot of reassurance, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for an anxious kid. But kids with OCD are actually doing a compulsion in disguise, and so when you give them that reassurance, you complete the OCD loop for them, which is not helpful, because basically it's what I tell parents. You're the sink. So you're the sink when they're, like, if they had to hand wash, you're the sink. So a confessional OCD type of behavior would look like this. You would say, your child might say, Mom, I'm having a bad thought. Does that sound familiar? Do you ever hear that? And then you might say, well, what's the matter, honey? And they might say, I think that I called you a bad name in my head. Or, I think that I kicked somebody at school today, but I'm not sure. So the way that you can tell the difference between confessional OCD and just like regular behavior or just reassurance is, one, they're not sure if they did it, or it was a really long time ago. Like when I was 2, Mom, I think I called you a name, or I had a thought about you. So normally it's like way in the past about some bad behavior that seems very trivial, or it could be something that they think they did that they didn't do. And so this can also happen in contamination OCD and harm OCD, where kids want to get the reassurance, hey, you know what? I just touched a Clorox wipe, and then I touched my eye. Do you think that I'm going to hurt myself? Do you think that was poisonous? Is that bad? And so a lot of times they'll get reassurance from you in that way. So whenever your child looks like they're trying to do some sort of compulsive behavior with you, and this is easier said than done, trust me, I get that. But you want to respond with, tell your Mr. Bossy I'm not talking to him. Tell your dictator I'm not talking to him. Or, oh, it looks like your dictator is bothering you again. I don't talk to your dictator, but you can if you want to. So having that name, having personified it, does really help, because then you're not really discounting your child, and you're not discrediting them, or like you're not being rude to them. You're talking to the OCD. You're not talking to your child. And that really helps. It does make a difference. Now, some kids are going to get really upset. And so in my practice, I talk to parents about gauging. If you see your child looks like they're a deer caught in headlights and you're like, gosh, they're really needing this reassurance right now. They're constantly coming back to me and they're like, but mom, just tell me, is this poisonous? But mom, just tell me, like, do you think that I scratched the car? And you can tell that they're escalating. Then you can say, you know what? Fine. I'm going to be talking to your OCD right now. So just give me a minute. And then talk to the OCD and say, dictator, I really wish you'd leave my kid alone. Okay. But yeah, you're fine. But next time I really don't want to talk to you. And so what you're doing is you're separating out talking to your child and talking to your kid. And that really helps. Like when my child's not eating and he'll say, oh, I just don't know, it kind of looks weird and it smells weird and I'm not sure, I might get nauseous afterwards. I'll say, well, tell your worry cloud that you're hungry and that you probably should eat anyway. And normally I get some pushback because that's my kid. And so, it's not the worry cloud, but I've named it and I've put it out there. I've planted some seeds. So you want to ideally pull yourself back from participating in your child's compulsions. And it depends on how long your child has had OCD. So if you've been doing a lot of compulsions with your child for a really long time because you didn't realize it was OCD, you're not going to be able to all of a sudden not do all of that. I totally get that. I think sometimes as parents, it's just good for us to know where we want to go and head in that direction. And then sit down with your child and say, look, and hopefully you have a good therapist, because I feel like therapy is really important in OCD. Parents wait way too long to find a good therapist, and it's unfortunate because OCD is one of those things that is highly, highly treatable with ERP, and we'll talk about that. It's my last point. Highly treatable with ERP, but parents have a wait and see approach for OCD because it's scary and they can kind of chalk it up to, well, maybe it's a habit and maybe I can just wait and see. But if you get your kid in early, it's so much easier for me to help, so much easier for other therapists to help when the child doesn't have really acute OCD. So hopefully you've partnered with a therapist. It's kind of hard to find a therapist who truly understands OCD. So if you're having a hard time, you can go to the International OCD Foundation, and it's iocdf.org, and they have I think it's like a find help button, and go and find somebody who's listed there, because if they're listed on that website, they're going to know how to treat OCD in a very effective way. And that's what you need, because I can't tell you how many parents I've worked with where they've come and they've seen maybe 4 or 5 other therapists before getting to me, and their kid's only like 9 or 10. And they've done all sorts of other types of therapies. They've done talk therapy and breathing, and all those are great things, but they're not going to help the OCD. You really need ERP. So you want to make sure that you get some additional support. Once you have that, and if you don't have that, there are online resources, which is a really good thing. But you're going to want to partner with your therapist and do things at home. I completely engage the families I work with to do the bulk of the work at home. And that was the third point I wanted to talk about today, because I teach families, one, that although it seems very loving to give in to your child's compulsions, and most of the parents don't even realize that that's what they're doing. It's counterintuitive, but it's not helpful at all. It's actually harmful and hurtful. And so you want to pull back. So the first thing I do with families is I say, okay, everything that you're doing, you can stop that. You can't control your child. You can't control them doing their compulsions. This is their battle. And I do tend to get some very overzealous parents who are very gung-ho, which is awesome. They roll up their sleeves and they are ready to go. But I have to explain to them, calm down. This is your child's battle, and they have to be 120% on board in order for this to work. And so I spend a lot of time educating the child about OCD and how OCD works and how it works in their brain and how it tricks them, and how I kind of talk about the neural pathways as being a highway, and the more they go on this highway that they're driving, they're making it like a 6-lane highway. And do they really want to do that? So when they don't give in to their compulsions, they are kind of destroying their highway. That's the analogy I use in my online class, to teach parents. And it's the videos that I show kids so they can understand it. So once you partner with a therapist or you do this on your own, you want to slowly pull back on your own participation. And you say to your child, I love you, and from now on, I'm not going to partner with your dictator. I'm just not going to do it because I love you. And even if they get really angry and they're getting really mad, just be like, I'm not high-fiving your dictator. I love you. I want you to get healthy. You can do your compulsions if you want, but I'm not going to. Then the third thing, the last thing that I recommend, and this really is important, ideally if you have a therapist, but I understand that not everybody has a therapist. It's really hard to find one. I even had a hard time finding one for my own kid, which is totally bizarre to me because I wanted someone who specialized in ERP, and I had a hard time finding someone who did that and worked with kids. So I totally feel the pain. I think it's actually really, really hard to do. But you want to set up, I call them challenges at home. So they are like exposure, but I just call them challenges. And without having you on board, when kids come to me for an hour a week at the most, I'm not going to be able to make much impact. So I can do an exposure in the office. So an exposure, for those of you that don't know, I should probably just stop and explain that. It's ERP, Exposure Response Prevention, where you just want to expose the child to their trigger that will trigger their OCD, and then you want to encourage them to not do their compulsion. So what you're wanting to do is to get them to fight that itch, and explain that to kids. It's going to want to itch. It's going to be it's going to have a temper tantrum, and it's going to want you to do the compulsion. And when you ignore it, then eventually the itch goes away and the itch doesn't come back as strong over time, which is amazing. And I've seen this in my office happen very quickly, and it's very uplifting. But the child has to be on board. So a lot of times they understand the biology of it a little bit. And then I do a lot of reinforcers, and that tends to motivate kids a lot. So they earn things. And so I call it the OCD game. And I talk about this in my online class, the OCD game. And there's different levels that you can do in order to fight OCD. So the first level is just calling it out and being like, I know this is you, OCD. And parents can do the first level for their kids, really, even though it'll drive them nuts. But when you go home, you want to start developing challenges. And if you have a therapist, you partner with your therapist and you say, what challenges can I do at home? What exposures? And so I'll give you an example. So with my son, he's got an eating issue. We just talked about that. And so I have this worksheet. I have these worksheets in my class. So I print them out and I'll say, okay, every time you eat a food that's not on your go-to list, then that's a challenge. And 5 of those challenges, you earn blah, blah, blah. He's in a Roblox, so he earns Robux. Do you know what I'm talking about? Whatever. It motivates him. And so he really wouldn't be motivated as an 8-year-old to do this in his own time because he really doesn't see the problem. It's just easier to itch the OCD itch than to resist it. And so he really wants Robux, whatever it's called. And so he'll say to me, Mom, can I do a challenge? And so I said, yeah, sure. Well, what can I eat? And then I'll say, what would you like to eat? And he'll name all of his OCD food. Well, can I have goldfish? No. Can I have this? So eventually I'll pick a food that I know he's eaten in the past before he really got this kind of problem. And then he will eat, one of them was hot dogs. And so he ate a hot dog. And then ironically, this is what happens. So then I mark the challenge, and then he does 5 challenges. So he did hot dogs, I can't remember, eggs, and I can't remember what the rest were. And then he earned his reward. And then once he earned his reward, this is the interesting thing about exposure response, is he continually ate those foods. They were no longer a problem. I know Rachel's saying that it's hard to find motivators for teens. That is true. But I will say that, thank you, Christina. I'm glad these are helpful ideas. So I do find motivators for teens. Unfortunately, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. So you have to kind of know the currency of your child. I do for teens in my office. I spend a lot of money on the kids that come to see me, but I do iTunes credit. And so I do $20 iTunes credit. And so if they do, I think 5 to 10 challenges, they can get iTunes credit. I have a girl right now that's earning a fish tank. You can find things. Every person, every kid, no matter what age, has some sort of currency. You just find what it is. So, if they're into a band, if they want to go to a concert, all of those things are great motivators. And what I find is the motivators tend to encourage them. So I call it the OCD game, and I make it as fun as it can be, because OCD is not really fun. But I try to make it fun. So we call it the OCD game. I talk about levels, and I go into this in my online class. I won't bore you with it, but I talk about, each different level has different power, so if I delay it, it has power. If I ignore it, if I do the opposite, and then exposures are the best and highest power. And then they're earning things for these challenges. And so when kids are motivated by these challenges, they start to feel like they can beat OCD. And the way I explain OCD to kids is I say, you know what, it's a paper dragon. I don't know why I always use that analogy, but I'll say it looks really big and it looks really scary, but when you face it and you crumple it, it is like this small. And really, it's just been lying to you. And so the external motivators are there initially, but what happens is intrinsically they develop motivation as they progress, and it's beautiful. But the parents are key. I'm key with my own kid. If I didn't do those challenges on the refrigerator, he wouldn't improve. And the kids that I work with, if I tell them, okay, go home and do this homework, and they don't do it, I call them challenges because one girl had a problem with the name homework, but if they don't do it, they're not going to make progress, because it's a 24/7 job, and parents really need help doing that. Now you can go and get the app NoCD. I use that in my practice. It's really helpful because you can track. So sometimes I'll print it out on my refrigerator, but the teenagers I work with, they like the app because they can do it on their own phone. We'll set it up in my office, or parents can set it up, and then they can track it on their own and they have control. Because I'll tell parents, this is their battle. This is not your battle. And so it's really important that we empower them. They can be there to support, but not offer reassurance. And that's a really big one too. So you can't sit there when your child's doing a challenge or an exposure and say, oh, it's okay. It's not really going to hurt you. It is awesome. It is a great tool. And I think the teenagers really like it because they don't have to involve anybody else. And they can kind of track it themselves, and then they can show me, and I can see where they've gone and what they've done, which is really helpful. So you basically want to, overall, if I was to summarize everything I've talked about, you want to call out OCD. You don't want to let it hide in your house. The longer it hides, the worse it will get. And that's not fair to your child or to you or to your house. So call it out first, and then you want to name it, and you want to not feed into it. So do not high five the OCD. Do not be complicit with the OCD, because it's not helpful. And that's one thing that you can control. Don't be overzealous, because it's not really helpful if you go around measuring the soap or saying like, stop doing that, you're doing it again. You really want to respect your child. And I talk a lot about that in my online class as far as, coming up with an agreement. What role do you want me to play in your battle with OCD? And even if they're little, like with my son, I'm like, this is your battle. It's not mine. I don't want you to look like you're starving to death. I don't want you to look all skin and bones, but you're the ultimate person who has to do this, not me. That's really key, no matter what age, because this is not your battle. And sometimes that's a little bit, anxiety reducing, because you honestly, even if you wanted this to be your battle, which I totally would love this to be my own battle, I can't, because it's not my battle. It's my kid's battle. And so the only thing you can do is set up these challenges, and you can't force them. And so I have the challenge list on my refrigerator, and I say, if you want this, you can do a challenge. And he asks me. And every week when I have kids in my office, they set up challenges and they're excited. They want to go home and they want to do them, mainly because they're trying to earn something. But then they're excited because they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have to take a shower before I go to bed anymore. So much less time. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. I'm not afraid of this word anymore. I can wear these clothes again. And it's so exciting to see that progress. So if anyone has questions, you can ask really quick. I know I've been rambling for a while, and so I was going to try to keep this at a half hour. Thank you for coming and listening. If you want more information, I, just for OCD Awareness Week, am having people enroll in my mini OCD class for free, and you can find that at anxioustoddlers.teachable.com. There's no www. I have no idea why. But join the mini class because I go over all the misperceptions about OCD. And if you don't understand OCD, you're not going to be able to help your child. So I do have a larger class. It's like 39 lessons. It's kind of a beast of a class, but it explains everything about OCD, and then it also breaks down how to do ERP at home. And I give you all the worksheets and stuff, although you don't really need all that fancy stuff. But if you want help walking through it, if you can't find a provider in your area or in conjunction with therapy, you can go check that out. It's anxioustoddlers.teachable.com. And you can always see me at anxioustoddlers.com. That's kind of where I live. It's my website. I have a podcast and a YouTube channel, and I would love to see you over there. And I also have a private Facebook group, so come and chat with me, and I will talk to you later. I hope you find the sparkle in everything you do. Take care. Bye.
Having a child with OCD is not only difficult and devastating for the child, but it takes its toll on the entire family. Watching your child do behaviors that don't make sense to anybody, and not even to your child, can be completely heartbreaking. And most parents don't know what to do or what their role is in how to help. OCD is a really complicated issue, and even a lot of therapists don't understand how to treat OCD. And so as a parent, you might be lost as to where to find support or what you're supposed to do in order to help your child crush their OCD. To make matters worse, many kids hide their OCD from their parents, so their parents don't even realize the extent of the issue.
I know my behavior doesn't make any sense. It's embarrassing. I don't want my parents to know. My parents don't even know half of the rituals I have to do.
Being in the dark is the worst thing for your child's OCD. No parent has to sit idly by, clueless about how OCD works and how they can actually help their child, because OCD is very treatable, and most of the approaches can be done very easily in your own home. I created the online class, Parenting a Child with OCD, to help you understand your child and understand OCD, but more importantly, to give you the tools to actually help your child beat OCD at home. You can take the online class at your own pace. Every lesson is there for you the minute you enroll, and you can go through it as fast or as slowly as you want to. You can also view the lessons on any device, so you can watch it on a tablet, on the computer, or even on the go on your phone. And every lesson is short and simplistic, so that you don't miss any concept or idea. Not only do you learn exactly how to implement cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure response prevention techniques at home, but you are given 23 handouts and worksheets that you can do with your child to implement the things that I teach you in this class. The class comes with 39 lessons that cover every aspect of OCD, from the origins of OCD to what themes to look for within your child, how to talk to your child about their OCD, how to talk to their siblings about OCD, and most importantly, exactly how to carry out exercises and challenges that will crush your child's OCD at home. OCD only gets worse as time goes by. Don't waste any more time. You can do things to help your child right away. Take the class, learn the lessons, and implement strategies and challenges at home and start seeing some improvement right away. You know your child the best. You see them struggling. You don't have to feel hopeless anymore. There are skills you can teach them. Let me show you how. You can enroll today at anxioustoddlers.teachable.com.